Welcome back. I'm so glad that you are here. And that just shows to me that you are 100% committed on healing your hearts of everything you experience every single day. And I have to tell you, I'm super excited about our guest podcast host today. And I'm going to have her introduce herself in a minute. But she is absolutely passionate about this topic about burnout. And her specialty is really nursing burnout. But in the field of healthcare, this is something we are all faced with. And it's something we all need more education on. So, welcome, Doris Taylor. I'm so excited that you're here. Why don't we start by you just sharing with the audience a little bit about yourself and why you're so passionate about this topic?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me here. I'm super excited about it. I've been a nurse for over 20 years. I graduated nursing school in 2001. And within the first year of graduation, I was burned out. You know, I have a BSN. So at 6 months after graduation, I got a call in the afternoon. I was working night shift, of course, on an adult med surge floor, and they wanted me to come in early to be a charge nurse. Not training, no preparation, just, "Hey, come in early and start doing this." And, I was 24 at the time, so no life skills in managing the, interpersonal relationships on a floor. Plus, figuring out assignments and acuity and just being so young and not having any training and then being pushed into that because I didn't know you could say no either. I'm sure there was
Right.
people that said no. And so by the end of that first year, I was burned out. And so I started travel nursing, and that definitely helped to be
Mm.
a travel nurse in the early 2000s, just because you're not in that uh, drama that you can get sucked into, the politics on a floor. But I've struggled with burnout for, you know, different burnout cycles off and on for the last 20 years. And then the last 10, 13 years of my career, I worked in a clinic at a local pediatric hospital. And I was burned out for probably most of that decade. Some times were better than others, but it's always been a big struggle with me in burnout. And so it's, and I quit because of burnout. I quit in 2021 because suddenly I just couldn't see myself doing this job for another 20 years before I retired. And that was a big catalyst for me to be like, I have to do something else. And I quit in 2021. I quit working at the hospital, and I then launched my own business, and that evolved into working with nurses in burnout because that's where I had been. And I want to well, looking back at where I was, I can see, like, if I had had someone say, "These are the things to look at in your life and what you're doing and how to help me move out of burnout," like, I think things would have been a lot different. So I want to be able to help nurses who are in that spot, who are like, you don't want to continue being how you are, but you don't necessarily know what the next steps are.
Yeah.
And I don't, you know, I don't think you have to quit nursing in order to not be burned out, but it's building a skill set and a toolbox to help you manage your nervous system and look at your learned emotional coping skills. And figuring those pieces out can be a life changer and like keep you like so many nurses are passionate about what they do. And a lot of times that's why we stay where we are in these work environments, and you're passionate about these patients. You talk to like a hospice nurse and they tend to be very passionate about what they do. Like there's niches for nurses who are like super passionate about your specific patient population. And but you get to a point where you have compassion fatigue and you just like it affects your whole life and you can't continue doing it. And I feel that you can learn skills and make subtle changes and you can stay where you are. And
Yeah.
so that's my history of like kind of how I
How you got here.
yeah.
Yeah, I love that story because, you and I, when you and I had our conversation, we were connected from someone else who had said to me, Arleen, you've got to meet this person and she's going to be really great on your podcast, this idea of healing. You and I talked about we need more education on burnout, right? We need more education, like you stated, on like what to look for, how to manage in these complex situations. So we all know that, right? And when you were telling this story, I was just thinking about my entire nursing career and, the periods of time where I was like, absolutely burnout, checked, 100%, like I agree, right? And then there were periods where I was like, I'm going to put my feet back in the water and I'm going to try, something different or try my skills because that calling, that deep calling to serve and to care for people, it's so visceral, right? And it pulls you back and that's why I'm excited about us having this conversation today because I want to normalize this idea that burnout is something that you have to receive, like you said, tools in your toolkit and education on. My niece, I'm so proud of her yesterday. She texted me because she just became a licensed registered nurse. And I've been like rooting and cheering and so excited. And one of the first things I said to her was, now goes this journey of finding where you're going to work. And let me give you some advice of like the things that you need to advocate for so that you get the training that you needed. Like you said, you were 6 months in and somebody thought, oh, this person's going to be great being a charge nurse because they're already picking things up quickly. But we have to protect ourselves and we need to make sure the research shows it takes about a year to be comfortable in a role, right? So we want to make sure that leaders are setting people up for success and that the workforce is really being educated on the things that you can do, like you said. Had somebody had told me it's okay to push back and say, hey, I'm not saying no, I'm just saying not right now, right? Like I still have some learning to do. So, when you and I talked, we talked about so many factors that sort of contribute to burnout. And, I'm curious to really hear from you if there's something that you really think is fundamental in this education of the workforce, like that people have got to get this concept when it comes to burnout, like top of their mind, like they have to be thinking and laser focused on it. What would you say it would be?
It would be to consciously and intentionally soothe your nervous system.
Mm,
That's that's really the basis of where burnout really kind of starts is our dysregulated nervous system. And I don't call it self-care because self-care has such a negative connotation these days, which is very understandable. It's all very surface, it's all very kind of fluffy,
yeah,
how I like to describe it. And really, but being intentional with, I do these things, not just to do these things, like you're not connecting an intention behind it. But once you are very conscious and intentional behind, like, I do these things every day to soothe my nervous system because there's a window of tolerance that you are looking for. And that's in that window of tolerance is where you have resiliency. But so many of us live in a hyper-arousal state or a hypo-arousal state. And so hypo-arousal is like when you have a shift and then you come home and you crash on the couch, you're binge
right.
watching your TV shows, you're scrolling your social media for hours on end, like you just shut down and your body's in this mode of I need to protect myself. That's what it's trying to do is protect itself.
That's me. That's my go-to. That's where I go, right? Absolutely.
And so you're creating this space
Right.
with in your nervous system to, one, be able to recognize when you start going into that space, you know,
Mhm.
and then you have these tools of, I will go for a walk, I will get together with a friend, I will do some sort of movement, because in that hypo-arousal state, you want to kind of stimulate yourself to move up into that window of tolerance. And then on the flip side of that, you have the hyper arousal. And that's, you're taking on all these projects. You've never have any downtime in your life. Like, you're always helping other people, even outside of work, right? Like, you're always doing these things to um, essentially, like, not allow your nervous system to relax, because that's how you've been conditioned. That's part of the learned coping skills. And so you're always going, going, going. And so when you notice yourself of, I go from the time I get up to the time I go to bed, and then I can't go to sleep, or you're waking up at 3 a.m., that's an indication of this high cortisol or high stress and the hyper arousal in your nervous system. And if you can start creating space to be like, I recognize I'm doing this, and then I intentionally create time to do nothing, or read a book, or do something that is very soothing to your nervous system, like water, like going for a swim, going to the beach, something that is very soothing to the nervous system. So you're bringing that nervous system down into that window of tolerance, and you're intentionally creating time to do that. So you're creating space in your nervous system to start recognizing what your go-to reaction is. And you can do both. Like, I've gone through both cycles, and then until I would frequently fill my life and time with all these things that I wanted to do. And, I was a single mom with 2 kids. So you're constantly busy. But come wintertime, around the holidays, I would just hit this wall. And then I would just lay on the couch and binge watch TV shows for days, because I
Mhm.
just could not physically do anything. And so I would intentionally start creating time during the holidays where I would have a long weekend just to do nothing. Like, I wouldn't have my kids. I would just
They could
binge
just
watch.
disconnect. Yeah.
Right. And so it's building into your nervous system that pause and that space to recognize where you are. But that's really kind of the fundamental, and the thing to really focus on is like, where's my nervous system? And then how can I soothe and nourish my nervous system? So it goes way beyond just doing some self-care every day. It's very intentional with
Mhm.
what you're doing, and that's the focus. Like, that's the first step, really, is kind of building some resiliency and that pause and that space in your nervous system. And then you're not as reactive. And when
Mhm.
a manager comes and tells you you're not doing enough, you're not organized, you're just not, right? And you want to, you get into this reactive state.
Mhm.
But you're building in that pause, so then you're not as emotional, because I think a lot of managers can come, or can view nurses as like, oh, we're just emotional, and we're not uh in a space where we can take that time and pause, and then come back and give that pushback. You're either like in that people pleasing mode of like, oh, you say yes to whatever management tells you, or you get mad or pissy.
Yeah.
So you're creating that pause and space in your real life, like in your everyday life, to be like, okay, how do I want to respond to this? And then that leads into more like self autonomy as well. So they're all really interconnected, but it all starts with the nervous system, like you soothing your nervous system and building in that time and space. for it.
So I love this topic, and there's just so many things. Like my brain is going like 20 different directions because number one, I do believe that you can vacillate between the two. I look at very specific times in my life where I was sort of at a hyper state, especially when I had smaller children and I had a lot to do at home, right? And I had to work on pacing and pulling myself back because that's where you go, right? And so I do think the body is beautiful, and what we know from the research is when we're in that homeostatic stasis, like where it's like we're perfectly balanced, that's where our body is going to be the most functional, right? And that's why, right, when you think about it, when you start going off in these ranges, of hyper and hypo, they're you're going to see different responses. So I think about that. And then I also think about that, like, how are we going to get there? But I also am thinking about, before we jump into the how, I want to just make a general statement, which is, why I was so passionate about not just healing the hearts of healthcare, but then creating the leadership edition. Because let's face it, leaders are not skilled enough and they don't have enough education around how to interact with staff in a way so that their response or their communication is not just, by nature of the way it's being said, triggering somebody to get them into a response, like a reactionary state. So we need more work sort of on that leadership
Mhm.
place and space to teach leaders like there is a way to connect with people, create those trustful relationships, and create that safe psychological space where you can have conversations with somebody and not trigger them, right? But I think with healthcare, I think it's very easy for leaders to forget. And in the crazy busyness, they're forgetting that pause. Like you said, like they're forgetting to build that in before they're having a response. So that's just sort of my like piece on leadership. But that's not for today. But I do think it's so important for people to recognize like your leaders are not going to be perfect, and they're gonna respond to you in a certain way. It doesn't mean we have to react, right? We can control what's happening in our sphere. So let's talk a little bit about the how. Like, we talked about a little bit about identifying. So if I'm that type of person and I see myself like, yeah, that's me. Like I binge watch an entire series, right? I can blow through 10 episodes of something and then I'm like, where did those 10 hours go, right? And I'm up all night long doing it, right? Till 2, 3 in the morning, right? So if that's somebody, they're on that hyper end where they're just go, 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 going, and there's absolutely no space there to even breathe, and they're moving from one thing to another. How do we teach this, these different tools? Because I want people to realize when you're in both states, because you're a healer and you're interacting with your patients, that energy, it's going to go somewhere. It's going to leave your body and attempt to like enter into that person that you're engaging with or you're providing care to. So let's talk a little bit about those tools. Like, what are some of the things that you would recommend?
A lot of times I look at what has worked before in the past. So like
Mm,
when I work with clients, and we talk, and I asked, in that conversation, it comes out usually of like, I've done this in the past. Like I've done meditation or I've done walks with my dog, and it makes me feel good. Like I like doing this, but you just don't create that time and space to be consistent with it. So a lot of times it's looking at what has worked for you in the past where you feel good and it makes you feel centered and grounded. And then look at, because that's something that's familiar, and you
mm-hmm.
want to do something that's familiar, because if you're starting something new, like there's been so many times where I'm like, I'm going to meditate 5 days a week because I know that's really good for me and it's really good for my nervous system and it makes me feel good. But doing something that is new and making it 5 days a week, so then it's a big change. And no matter how good it feels and good it is for you, that's overwhelming and
Yeah.
you're not going to do it. So it's looking at what has worked before in the past that you've gotten really good results or and it doesn't have to be complicated. You
Right.
want to make it very simple and bite size, and then be like, I want, and just make a commitment of, I'm going to do this 1 day a week. 1 day a week where maybe you're not working. And so
Mhm.
you can create that time to do it, and then tell a couple of people that this is your plan and intention, because then that gives that accountability piece.
Yeah.
If you don't tell anyone about it, it's really easy to be like, oh, I'll just do that next week, or
Right.
just forget about it, and then a month later, you're like, "Oh, yeah, I was gonna do this thing, and then I haven't done it." So if you can tell someone who will ask you later, like in a week, like, "Hey, did you do that meditation, or did you go for a walk?" Or even having a burnout buddy and be like, "Hey, let's go for a walk every Saturday morning," or something, right? And so, because you wanna make it, attainable, and you wanna make it sustainable. And, then you build on that. You're like, "I
Mm.
do this one thing once a week, and it feels really good, and it makes me feel good that I'm supporting myself." And then you do that for 3 weeks, and then you're like, "Oh, now I'm going to do it twice a week." So you
Right.
really just kind of build on it, but you have to make it really bite size and make it a habit that you do, or a pattern or a ritual, something, whatever resonates with you to make it sustainable, whatever you want to call it. And then you build on that, and you're like, okay, now I can do it twice a week. Now I can do it 3 times a week. Now I can do it every day. You're just making that, um, because the ideal would be you do one or two things every day to really soothe your nervous system, because then when things go sideways, like, you can fall back on the window of tolerance, or that resiliency that you've already built in your nervous system, and you can create that pause, and then, like, react to whatever situation is. Or, like, if you're in an or emergent situation, like on a floor or something, then, like, you're probably a little bit more clear-headed and solid, or grounded, and able to do whatever you have to do, but then take the time afterwards to then, um, kind of recenter yourself. So then you're not so, like, scattered afterwards, or disassociated. I think a lot of times I call it kind of putting things into the closet. So we deal with a lot of trauma. We deal with a lot of issues at work with other people, with our patients. But we don't have the time to process what happens, right? So then you kind of put it in the closet, and then you kind of shut the door, and you never really process those feelings and what happened. And But if you're building a little bit of pause and resiliency into your nervous system, then you might be able to open that closet door a little bit and process that, and then start moving forward. Like, it's just all kind of builds into itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think, when it comes to forming habits, sustainable habits, ones that, we're carrying sort of as a regular routine, I think one of the things that we have to always keep in mind is we have to catch ourselves, right, in the moment, when we see our nervous system is sort of going to either hypo or hyper, right? And so if you're that professional healthcare worker and you're on the floor, right, and something happens to you that triggers you or sets you off, right, there's nothing wrong with number one, noticing that that's happening in you, right?
Mm.
So recognizing that, okay, this is how I'm feeling. That's like step one. And then I think step two is allowing yourself a moment and giving yourself permission to really just say, all right, I'm going to take a few deep breaths, right? And I'm going to just like concentrate on my breathing and just allow myself to feel that emotion so that I can release it.
Mhm.
What we know to be true in the research is you're not going to be able to release the emotions unless you go intentionally through the exercise of feeling the emotions. Like if you're just trying to suppress your emotions, you're going to find yourself doing all of these alternative things to yourself that are just not going to make any sense, right? It's like, why, for years, right? I remember as a young child, I could visualize it with my mom. She was a nurse and she worked the night shift and she was raising 6 kids and it was craziness, right? And her way of coping sometimes was like to take out like, and make a big bowl of ice cream and just like take her feelings out that way, right? And so we all do things that are very different and unique, but I think the best success we have is catching ourselves when it's happening. That's the best opportunity in terms of education, right? Wouldn't you agree with that? It's like catching yourself in
Yeah,
the moment.
it's definitely being able to recognize where you are and to
Yeah.
recognize also that you need to process those emotions. Like
Yes.
when I graduated nursing school in 2001, like there was no talk about
No.
burnout or what you're going to see as a nurse. I remember one instructor who had been an ICU nurse had talked about how crazy it is on the floors and how addicting that can be. But when you take a vacation and you leave the floor and then you come back, like you can see the chaos of the floor. But there was no talk about like how in the day to day, how to manage any of that or manage the trauma that you're going to see and experience. And that's why I say like there's that closet. Like we take what we experience and feel and we put it in the closet and then we don't know how to deal with it because we haven't been taught how to deal. And there's not a lot of talk of debriefing from these situations, right? Like you don't talk about, you just kind of move on to the next patient and the
Mhm,
next
mhm.
thing they have to do. And so definitely just being able like to build in that resiliency in your nervous system and be like, okay, like I'm feeling very triggered with whatever this is. Or you might not even know because you're just busy, right? But being able to recognize that feeling and then create that pause of like, and then create that pause to be able to process, be like, whatever this is, whether I can recognize it or name it, but creating that time to process and check in and be like, okay, I'm feeling really anxious right now and I don't know why. And being able to like, how do I help myself
Yeah.
process that anxiety and do it before I try to go to sleep and then I can't go to sleep,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it's definitely a skill set to start being able to create that pause and recognition and not being afraid to process your feelings too. Because
Yeah.
sometimes you can get afraid of, like, I'm just going to get stuck in
Mhm.
this feeling. But like you said with your mom, like if you're not going to process the feeling, it's going to come out
Somewhere
somehow,
else, right?
right?
Yeah. It just
Because
does.
your emotions and your nervous system have to process it somehow. And so that's where we get into like the learned emotional coping skills of um, what you do when you're stressed and overwhelmed. And you might not even think of what you're doing, but it your body innately knows that it needs to process something. And so, there's a lot of maladaptive coping skills that we do
Mhm.
to process those feelings. And we don't, it's
I didn't
like,
realize that.
yeah, you don't realize what you're doing. It's like the shopping addiction where you're late night, you're on these shopping websites and you're like, "Oh, I'm just buying things and I don't know why I'm buying things," but is you're self-soothing is what
Mhm.
you're doing and you're not even really conscious of what you're doing. You're like, "I just like handbags," or like whatever, right? Like I'm buying these things and that's just a way of you're soothing your emotions. And so it's creating these more adaptive positive coping mechanisms to soothe your emotions and your nervous system a little bit differently. And I think that's really the key of also recognizing where you are without shame or guilt. And like these are things I do.
Yeah.
I can do things differently just because because I've done this my whole life or my whole adult life doesn't mean that I have to keep doing this, and you can change. Like um there's so much research now on like the neuroplasticity and
Hmm.
creating new habits and how that all like how we can actually create different habits that are sustainable. Um, and it's really exciting because especially a lot of nurses have like high ACE scores, the adverse childhood event scores, but there's a lot of research about how like you're not stuck in these patterns. Like you can create a sustainable change in these patterns that are like you've developed to soothe yourself,
Hmm.
but you can learn how to do things a lot differently. And I think that's important to also remember because you can get stuck. You can feel like I've always done this and this is just how it is. And you don't see how things can be done differently. And so it's nice to look at what is out there that you can do things differently. Like you're not necessarily stuck
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
your patterns that you've done.
Yeah. So, I mean, this journey is something that's very unique to the individual, right? Because, no one has the learned experiences and the learned coping mechanisms like somebody else has. So, I think it's deeply personal. I think this is where the deep work has to happen in terms of like our own education and looking inward in ourselves and our experiences and using those models like trauma informed care, so like you really recognize that the experiences that you may have experienced at any point in your developmental range could have been very traumatic to you and could be very triggering to you, and so even knowing your own triggers is going to best prepare you to be able to look and say, okay, when I am triggered or when I notice I am triggered, instead of doing this, I'm going to do this, or how can I support myself in that care. So let's talk a little bit about like ways that somebody could really take some of those ways that they've coped in the past. Those sort of maladaptive ways that have happened just over a lifetime. And maybe there's a person that's sitting out there and doesn't even realize that that's what they do. So how would you suggest, we get people to a point where it's like, A, you recognize it, and then B, instead you search to find, like you said, that nice safe place that you've been before where you've had a good response. Like, what advice would you give somebody that's sitting there?
So, um, a lot of times it's looking at, just kind of intentionally creating some space in your life and either journal about it, like just kind
Mm-hmm.
of do a brain dump and be like, this is where I'm at right now, and looking at what has worked. Like just really thinking, okay, I I had this one experience where I went to a retreat, or I had a really good conversation with a friend, or, just really bringing you back to a moment where you did feel safe and supported and grounded and centered. And then looking at how to recreate that in
Mm-hmm.
times that you're not feeling overwhelmed and stressed. And I know a lot of times you can feel overwhelmed and stressed all the time, but it's then intentionally creating some space of like, how do I create this space where I don't feel overwhelmed and stressed, even just for like 5 minutes a day. So I
Exactly.
remember a time when my kids were young, I was newly divorced, I was working full time in a clinic. So it was Monday through Friday. So it was that was nice. But I remember a time where just my cup of tea in the morning, my Earl Grey cup of tea, because, it smells really nice, and I would just hold it in the morning and smell it and be like, "Okay, this is, like, my heaven in a cup," right? Like, it's just sometimes it's just as simple as that, and then just kinda grasping onto that and be, like, holding onto it, and then building off of that, of how do I recreate this moment more frequently in my day or more frequently in my week? So then, like, your shoulders will come down, your breath will be a little bit deeper. And it's giving yourself that permission to have some pause and then just think about, how do I bring myself back to this one moment and then recreate that moment more frequently? Um, because that's where you're soothing your nervous system and you're kind of bringing yourself back to center a little bit more. And really, it's just starting in those simple times and then building off of that.
Yeah, and for some people, that journey is going to be looking at, the people they're closest around, that are within their sphere of influence, right? So if I'm, in a situation where I'm around a group of people, maybe they're friends or maybe they're close, it could even be a partner, right? And that person is adding right to that stress. That's really important to recognize, like how another person in your sphere is going to influence the way you're responding and reacting, right? Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, because I call them energy vampires,
Mm,
and they take your energy, and we don't have a lot of energy to begin with as nurses because we give so much to everyone else, especially at work. And then in your personal life, like, there's people that also kind of end up taking a lot of that energy. And so that when you build in that pause a little bit, part of that is then looking at where your energy is going, outside of work. Like, who do I feel supported by? And when I'm in that relationship with them, do I feel more energized or do I feel more drained at the
right.
end of, a coffee or the day spending with someone? And then learning to create some boundaries around that, because um yeah, who you are around, like, it affects how you feel, it affects your energy, it affects how you view the world. And then it's creating more of an intentional community of, these people really give me energy and I feel really heard and seen, and I feel like they support me.
Hmm.
And it doesn't have to be a big thing, right? It's just how you feel when you're around them can be a big thing. And then um looking at the people, and sometimes it's hard to create boundaries with family, especially. And but it can be important to be like, recognize how you feel, and then, like, if you're not able to create strong boundaries around people, then it's, how do I soothe myself afterwards and support
Right.
myself when I'm done with this interaction? And creating um the using leaning into your tools that you have to support yourself, and then reaching out, even like creating an intentional community of people who do support you.
Yeah. And so, the tools are going to be unique to the person because everybody's different, right? And so what works for me might not work for you. I think, recognizing if you're an introvert, right, it's going to give you more energy, is going to be in the quiet, drawing away from people, where if you're an extrovert, you're going to get the energy from being around people, right? So like knowing the difference between just even you as a person and sort of the way you were designed. And then
Mhm.
I also think, one of the things that I think is really challenging for healthcare workers, and nurses in particular, is this idea that there are so many external factors that go into burnout, right? And even when you look at many things that they really can't have an impact on, right? Like administration, from an administrative perspective, right? And so that can cause a lot of challenges because, you're coming to work and there are lots of things that happen. It's healthcare. And I say this over and over again, pretty much in every education I can say, because it truly did happen to me this way, where nobody really explained to me very early on, just like you said, nobody talked about burnout. Nobody talked about burnout to me either. But nobody really explained to me that like healthcare was really going to be sort of this up and down continuum, that was going to be an environment that was full of unpredictability. Like things were going to happen in the every single day to day, sometimes minute to minute, hour to hour, that would be affecting me and my ability to provide care. Right? No one even had those conversations to say, like, so what would happen is I would naturally perceive that as a disruption, right? And I would, like, if I had somebody that was coding, or I had somebody, that I had an admission, or I had family members that were furious, right? I would see that as disruptive to my work day. And I think we need to do more about teaching people, like, this is healthcare. Like, this goes part and parcel with the way we provide care delivery. And what we have to do is we still have to allow ourselves to have the space to be present and to be able to do those things and recognize that things are still going to get done. I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to want to do things in a very task-oriented mindset. And I want to see us shift a little bit more to be more fluid, to be able to enjoy those moments, right? If you're having a conversation with somebody that maybe had a diagnosis or is dealing with something they didn't expect, right? Now they're in the hospital, now they're thinking, how am I going to pay my bills? I'm not going to be able to work for 6 months. I just got into an accident. I don't have this. I don't have that, right? That's a very heavy space to be in. And you, as a trained professional, can use therapeutic communication and get through to that person and just have such a beautiful impact on their world. But if you're so laser focused on, like, I can't do that because then I got to get this done and this done and this, then you're missing the moment, right? And I think that's the stuff we also have to talk about, because that's the stuff that's going to prevent burnout, I think, is sometimes we don't even realize we're in the moment where those experiences, because you're taking that superpower out that you have and you're just like giving someone a different perspective, and you're having them see something differently, and you've really settled them, like that's the stuff that you hold on to and you say,
Right.
right?
It's that connection, right? Like
Yeah.
a, a lot of times we thrive off of that connection with our patients. And that's a
Yeah.
huge reason that um, nurses do get burned out, is because we don't feel connected to our patients anymore.
Right.
Because you don't have, nursing school sets you up for tasks. Like that was my training. It was, these are the different tasks that you do. And but they don't delve into like how to connect with your patients,
While
and
you're doing it. Yeah.
right, and how to, like you said, navigate that connection and the things that you have to do. And yeah, but a lot of nurses, like once you kind of get into it, like it's that connection that you feel with your patients, and being able to have that time to like have a chat, or be able to hold space for someone who is going through a medical diagnosis or a treatment or something, right?
Hmm.
Because that's a lot of what we do, is we hold space
Yeah.
for patients and for
100%.
each other.
Yeah.
But it's so hard when you're like not able to, like you're trying to hold space for someone, but then yeah, the call bell is going off. I have meds I have to give.
Right. Right.
And so it is hard to create that space. But I also think if your nervous system is more regulated, and you're able to be more centered, then you can hold that space a little bit better, because
Yeah.
you're like, I can do this, that task can wait, or I can delegate to someone, you know, because then you're thinking a little bit more clear and you're not just in this overwhelm mode, because we get so much into you're overwhelmed and then you're like, I can't have this discussion with someone because I've got 10 other things I need
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah. And then, you're going to leave work and then you got 10 more things you're going to have to deal with the second you walk through the door. So, I often think about, like, for me, I know I've talked about this, like my journey for resiliency to learn this as a leadership competency it took me 3 years of like study and really, taking courses and really reflecting. And in the end of the day, it just wound up me learning two things. One is that music really spoke to me. So on my drive in and on my drive home, I would blare it and in the car and I would rock it out, right? It just released something in me. And I also think about, like, the burdens of raising families and working and all of the challenges that go with that. And I laugh because I think about Jim Gaffigan. I love him as a comedian, and it reminds me about how when he talks about, being a father of, like, I think he has 5 children. I think it's around that. And he says, like, my vacation is when I get out of the car and I walk behind the car, the minivan, to the other side to open the door, like that, like the 10 seconds I take, like, slowly, just to be like, oh, it's so quiet, right? It's so beautiful. So I do think some of it is like we have to shift the way we look at things. And I
Mhm.
think that with burnout, I want us to touch a little bit before we close on the range, right? Like the range of burnout is like if somebody is approaching burnout, we talked about like how they can sort of self-regulate and soothe. But let's go to like the far range where you have that person that's there today and they're like, I can't do it anymore. Like you said, I can't do it. Like, what advice would you give to that person that's really there? Because I want people to know that, we put a lot of education and work and skill development into this role, which we know we were designed to do. It's why we're here. It's why when people leave, they don't feel fulfilled, right? But so then what would you tell that person that's like on that edge? Like, how do we get them back closer to center?
I think really looking at how do you prioritize yourself? And sometimes you may need to take a break
Hmm.
and or a sabbatical
Yes.
to kind of recenter yourself and really work on the skills of soothing your nervous system. Because if you can get your window of tolerance back, because a lot of times in burnout you have like a little teeny window of tolerance, and really you want a wide window of tolerance in your nervous system. And sometimes I think you need to take a break because there is so much to deal with in the day-to-day working as a nurse. But we don't always give ourselves that permission to be like, I just need 4
A
weeks,
moment. Yeah.
right? Or a 6 weeks off, and just take some time and really think of how to build that resiliency into your nervous system, and then decide what's the next best thing for you. And the nice thing about nursing is that there's so many options. Like,
Oh
you don't
yeah.
have to give up your license.
Hmm.
And when I graduated, there was the option of you work inpatient or you work in a clinic. Like, there wasn't a lot of options for other jobs that was still within the nursing scope. And now there's a lot of options. Like, you don't have to stay inpatient and you don't have to stay in a clinic, or maybe you go per diem.
Right.
And maybe if that's an option, because then you're still doing the work, but it's not the same as working full time, right?
Yeah, you're doing it on your own terms.
But being able to give yourself that permission to kind of step back and be like, I don't want to give up my career, but I can't stay where I'm at, and giving yourself that permission to take a sabbatical and take some time off, and then really work doing that deeper work of how do I intentionally soothe my nervous system to support myself in that time of taking off, and then how do I like what are my emotional coping skills when I'm stressed or when I'm overwhelmed? Like what is that automatic tool that I use to soothe myself, and
Mhm.
use that time in a very intentional way, um, to do those, and then figure out like what is my next step,
Yeah,
because you get to a point where I just couldn't see myself coming back. Like I couldn't see myself working for another 20 years, but I don't think that has to be everyone's journey. And I think being able to take that time away and then just intentionally kind of look at how what your current skills are and how you want to be, and then create a life, like a work life that kind of fits into
absolutely. You
our.
know? And I mean, that's what drove me into nurse education is, I just, from the lens of being able to see where there were failures, right? I always journaled. Like you said, I have a big journal of writing things down. I think when you look back, you can really see things that you may have missed. So do totally and wholeheartedly believe that. But I also think just, looking at how you could use your skill and use it differently and teach people how to be advocates or teach people where their gaps are and what we could do differently. So like you said, there's so many different options. And I know you also are really big into teaching workshops. So while we close, why don't you tell people a little bit about where they could find you and connect with you if that's something they're interested in? They want to either participate in a virtual workshop or participate in one in person. I know you're out on the West Coast, but even how you could give them different tools that could help them as well. So share with them how they can connect with you.
Course. So my website is Moonshine Wellness, PNW. So P as in Paul, Northwest.com. And then same thing for Instagram and Facebook. I'm at Moonshine PNW. And I think the website's probably the easiest to get a hold of me. My contact information is on there. And I have a 90-minute workshop that I've developed on burnout, and I'm working with debriefing the front lines to offer 1.5 CEs for it as well. And so as soon as that gets up and going, I'll be offering Zoom workshops for
Mm.
you and your friends, for your department, because I really want to reframe how people view burnout. And I don't want to put the onus always on you as the nurse, that you have to create all the changes for yourself. There's a lot of um, ways that people are like internalized, like it's like my fault that I'm burned out,
Yeah, yeah,
there's something wrong with me. And
yeah,
really, a lot of these are learned things that you weren't taught how to do differently, right? And as an adult, we can start doing things a little bit differently and be different in our own lives. Um, but I have a newsletter that people can sign up with for through my website, to get. It's just usually just monthly newsletter, and you can get kind of tips and tricks and some advocacy. I love being an advocate for nurses and letting people know what's going on in the nursing world as well.
yeah.
So
I love
yeah.
that. I love that. And I love that you're normalizing this topic and I love that you're taking the shame piece away from it because we all have a different journey here in life school, right? We all come from different backgrounds. We all have different ways of coping and managing, right?
Yeah.
And that's so important to this topic. So I
Mhm.
just want to say how much I really enjoyed our conversation and how much I really honor the work that you're doing. I think it is just so needed for so many people in healthcare. And I look forward to hearing more about what you're doing and how our audience can really benefit. So thank you for everything that you do.
Yes. Well, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to come in and speak to your audience. Like, this is huge. And I think people will get a lot of benefit from re looking at how they think about burnout for themselves. So,
Totally agree.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope that you listen in on a future podcast. All right.
I
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.